Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get this webinar started. My name is Amir. I'll introduce myself more in a moment. You are joining just to make sure that you're all in the right place. You should be seeing our screen now. You're joining the first webinar in a series of three webinars around staying ahead of ransomware. Today's webinar is all about the cybercrime economy, Infostealers, and initial access brokers. Okay, with me is Ravid. Ravid, for some reason, I can't seem to be controlling the slides. So if you can move on to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is going to be the first in a series of three webinars. So I'll talk more about the other webinars at the end of this webinar, but if you haven't already registered for the full series, I highly recommend that you do. Ravid, you can move on to the next slide. Just a few housekeeping rules for this webinar. So although your audio is muted, you can ask questions at any time via either the chat or the Q&A panel. So really just feel free to ask questions. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Also, you should know this webinar is being recorded, so you will have access to the webinar following this webinar. And any other issues that you may encounter throughout the webinar, just reach out to the panelists via the chat, and we'll try to support you while we go. As I mentioned, my name is Amir Rubin. I head up product marketing here at Kela. Joining me today here is our VP of product management, Ravid. So with that, I will log off here. I'll let Ravid introduce himself and take it away. So go ahead, Ravid.
Sure. So thanks, Amir. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Ravid. I lead product management here with Kela. And today, what we want to talk about is apologies, is the cybercrime economy or the cybercrime financial ecosystem, and specifically hone into credentials, what they are, why they're interesting, how are they obtained by threat actors, and more importantly, how do they monetize, and hopefully end up with a note on why you should care, where does that meet the average network defender, and what you can do with it, and of course, set the stage for the next parts of this webinar series that will dive into specifically how credentials are used in tandem with ransomware and what you can do to avoid, hopefully, that. To start everything off, let's, again, generally set the stage and talk about bad guys on the internet, attackers, and why it is that they do what they do. Basically, the motivation for a bad person on the internet to do something bad to an organization or a different person. Generally speaking, there's a tendency to kind of bucket motivations into three major types of motivations. The first one is the ideological one. So attackers doing bad stuff on the internet due to political beliefs or social stands, basically mostly associated with what's commonly referred to as hacktivism. Those of you who have been in the industry around 2010, 2011, 2012 probably remember the big impact that Anonymous had at the time. Most recently, we see hacktivist activities around geopolitical tensions, like the war currently in Israel, or the war and the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. The second type of motivation is the financial motivations. So attackers doing bad stuff, carrying out attacks to make money, right? So basically to get some money home and do stuff that they want with it. We usually refer to that as financially driven cybercrime. And a notable example that probably everyone here knows of, or hopefully not, but still has experienced personally, that would be ransomware. The last bucket of motivation is the strategic motivation, usually associated with nation states. So that would be one nation state attacking another nation state, or attacking another nation state via a proxy. For example, targeting an organization. A good example would be a country attacking a technology company from a different country in order to obtain intellectual property to gain strategic advantage financially. Now, within these three types of motivations, all of which are associated with activities, attack attempts that all of you are probably seeing on a day-to-day basis, we today will be focusing on financially driven cybercrime. That is for a few different reasons. A, because we think it's interesting and cool and tells a good story, but most importantly, because financially driven cybercrime, as probably a lot of you intuitively know, just by the sheer volume of ransomware attacks and the coverage that ransomware attacks get, financially driven cybercrime is probably, in terms of volume, the most common cause for attack that organizations face, right? So this is an extract from the latest Verizon DBIR. It shows that overwhelmingly, the amount of attacks that organizations face are financially driven. And of course, that is supported by many, many, many other reports. Now, if we're talking about attackers wanting to make money, right? So again, carrying out a cyber attack in order to make money, what we should assume is that the attacker, right, the one carrying out the attack, should have a way to monetize the products or the deliverables of the attack, right? So in that sense, ransomware, for example, if we start at the end, is most importantly above everything else, a technique for monetization. Ransomware is basically attackers getting hold of things that the organization that was attacked once, so they can extort the organization, so they can get their stuff back, and as such, again, just a way to take something and create a monetization funnel for it. Every cyber criminal that wants to do something bad on the internet and wants to make money out of it must, of course, exist in a place where they have a way to monetize what it is that they do. As such, we can think of monetization almost like the eighth and final step of the cyber kill chain, right? Because if I go through reconnaissance and I choose the right malware and I spend a lot of time and money and effort on exfiltration infrastructure, but I do not have a guaranteed or hopefully guaranteed way to take the data that I've stolen and make it be worth my while, then I'm only losing money and only putting effort into something that does not help me. When we approach or when we think about how threat actors monetize, again, the deliverables and the products of a cyber attack, we can try and get an intuition for it by thinking about us as consumers wanting to buy something. In that case, and apologies for anyone who might find this offensive, let's imagine, right, ourselves or myself as a consumer, going to a butcher shop wanting to buy a piece of meat to make a burger at home. When I go to a butcher shop, I do not go to the stand and ask for a cow, right? Usually, I would ask for a specific cut that corresponds with the thing that I want to create or to make at home. Likewise, if I am the owner of a burger stand, I also don't go and ask for a cow. I ask for the cut that fits in with the way that I can monetize the meat that I purchase, right? I monetize it by turning it into a hamburger and then selling it to people who want it. That is also true, albeit it might not be as intuitive, but that is also true for attackers. When an attacker looks at a company or tries to carry out an attack, they don't see the business entity. That does not really have any inherent value to it, and there's no way to monetize a business entity, which is something abstract. What an attacker sees are specific cuts or specific types of assets to which they may have a way to monetize. So in that sense, an organization is made out of a bunch of assets, right? So what we see here is credentials and databases and endpoints and all of the different things that that organization might have. And we can look at attackers that specialize or again have a business model for taking a specific kind of asset and monetizing it. In that example, we have attackers that specialize in monetizing databases. Why? Because databases may contain PII, and that PII can be used to perform identity theft. As such, these attackers might not care if a database that contains phone numbers and dates of birth and full legal names, comes from a bank or from an insurance company, and if they even care if it comes from a bank or an insurance company, it's not as important if it comes from company X or company Y. What's important is that I can take that thing and monetize it, right? So we have threat actors that specialize in databases. We have one that specializes in code certificates, right? So they can use them to sell or to sign malware. And we have actors, of course, that specialize in credentials. That financial ecosystem in which threat actors are constantly trying to optimize the way they monetize their deliverables of attacks basically creates, like we see in every economy, specialization. We see different tiers and different type of actors that specialize in doing something specific. And as you can probably imagine, there are ones that specialize in obtaining and selling credit card data. We have other ones that specialize in producing and selling malware. And of course, as probably expected, we have many actors that specialize specifically in obtaining, selling, and monetizing credentials. And again, as could be expected, the rest of this webinar and the rest of the series will focus on credentials specifically, and again, on the actors who monetize them, and especially the ones who have gotten very good at doing so. Before we dive into credentials, let's align on some common language on what are credentials, especially in the context of this series of webinars. When I say, or when everyone that will be associated with the series says credentials, what it is that we mean. Because I think that for a lot of people within cybersecurity, that term could be a bit vague and also a bit contested. So to really set the stage to what we're talking about, when I talk about credentials, what I essentially mean is a is a combination of 3 different attributes. And again, they're intuitive, but still, when I want to go and log into a service or a resource that I'm using, like what we see here in this screenshot, I need a URL to place in my browser or in whatever client it is that I'm using. I need a username, and of course, I need a password. The password has to be plain text, right? Because me, a human being, I cannot pass a hash or an encrypted password to a browser because that simply does not work. All of these attributes, a full URL, a username, and the passwords, the combination of all 3 is what we call a credential in the context of today's webinar. If we just have a username and a password without the full context of the actual URL, that is not really interesting and not relevant, at least to the subject matter that we're talking about today. It's also important to note that, as we can see here in the examples that I have here, the URL is not just something that you put in the browser. It actually holds context. In this example, what we can gather by looking at the URL, both by the fact that the fully qualified domain name contains the string Citrix and by that query parameter that we see right here, we can understand that this URL is not just any old URL. It holds access to Citrix. So it says something about the resource that this URL allows me to access, and as such, it can also speak to actors in terms of how do they monetize it. So to make that a tiny bit clearer, let's talk about why threat actors like credentials to begin with, and when diving into why they like credentials, that essentially means how do they monetize credentials? What are the different use cases and specializations within the monetization and exploitation of credentials, and how does that work? Circling back to thinking about a company, an organization, and the type of assets that it has, and specifically honing in into credentials. And again, let's imagine that I currently am a big bank, right? I hold a bunch of different types of credentials. I have credentials that pertain to my C-level employees, for example, my CFO or someone in finance or my CEO, and they have credentials that allow them to log into, for example, their email boxes. Threat actors like these credentials very much. They like them because if a bad actor has access to the email box of a CFO in a big company, they can use that privileged access that is inherently trusted by other employees in the company to do stuff like send fake invoices and have the CEO, like quote unquote, the impersonated CEO, pass $29 million, as we see here, in wire fraud through a fraudulent invoice. That is what's commonly referred to again as wire fraud or as business email compromise. So one way to monetize credentials specifically for email boxes and specifically for email boxes that belong to high-ranking employees would be business email compromise. Other than that, the organization has many other employees, right? The bank in which I work has many other employees who are not the CEO or the CFO or anyone high-ranking. We have people in HR, we have people, in IT, and basically a lot of other people that may hold access to privileged or private information within the organization. Their credentials can be exploited as well. If, as an attacker, I get access to credentials of a software that's used to manage HR, so human resources applications, what I now have is access to a lot of PII. That PII can be sold, or I can hold that PII hostage and extort the organization and leak it if I do not get paid. Otherwise, of course, I can use VPN credentials obtained from IT employees in order to spread through the net, to move through the network and spread ransomware. Last but not least, organizations, again, the banking question that we imagined, also sometimes have consumers, clients. Their credentials are owned by the organization as well. In the bank example, these consumers would be the actual bank clients. Using their credentials, I can go into bank accounts and just wire money out of these accounts. And again, find a way as an attacker to monetize these credentials. And each and every way, right? So targeting the C-levels, targeting employees, and targeting clients is perceived and can be defended in a different way by the actual organizations. And as such, it is important to be very mindful and be very aware to the monetization techniques of actors, because they show or they hint at us what we can do as defenders to better protect ourselves. The way these credentials are monetized is actually pretty obvious when you go to the right places. So these are two screenshots from like chosen out of many different screenshots that actually show threat actors monetizing credentials in cybercrime forums. What we see here to the left is exactly as mentioned before. We see a threat actor that has obtained access to C-level email boxes, and they offer them for sale with, again, all of that context. Like the actor explicitly mentions that these email boxes belong to high-ranking employees, specifically people within finance and accountants and directors, and specifically in finance as well. That hints to us, again, as defenders looking into what bad actors do with credentials, that this particular actor is trying to monetize credentials via selling them to people who specialize, again, circling back to specializations within threat actors. They want to sell these credentials to people who specialize in business email compromise or wire fraud. To the right, we have credentials that are used for remote access or VPNs, which usually interest a different type of actor, specifically actors who want to, again, move through the network and monetize the access in a different way at the end of the day. So, mid-summary. The cybercrime is, or the type of cybercrime we'll be talking about today is financially driven. Threat actors have a lot of different specialities and things that they want. We're honing in into credentials and why they are monetized. And now let's dive even a tiny bit deeper. After establishing that there's demand to credentials, let's talk about the supply. And how does one get their hands on a juicy, fat trove of credentials? This might be a tiny bit of oversimplification, but still, basically the 3 points that you're seeing in front of you right now are the three generic ways to obtain credentials. You can either crack them or guess them. You can phish them, right? So steal them from their owner via phishing, or you can infect the owner's machine with an Infostealer and get all of the credentials directly from their computer. These would be, again, generally speaking, the 3 ways in which bad actors can obtain credentials. Each and every one, as you can imagine, has pros and cons to it, and specifically has different actors who specialize in it and have developed a business model and a business plan and a supply chain to make that happen. So let's take a tiny look into each and every one. When we talk about cracking, we essentially mean either brute forcing or password spraying or dictionary attacks. There's a lot of different fancy ways. Of course, they differ from one another, but still all of them say the same thing. An attacker takes a username, a URL, and a password, all these 3 attributes that we mentioned before, guesses that a valid user might exist within the combination of the 3, and tries to see if that works. That is very straightforward. It's simple to carry out, generally speaking, in the sense that it does not require a lot of knowledge, it does not require a major infrastructure, and most importantly, there are many out-of-the-box tools and scripts that one can use to take seed data from, for example, cybercrime forums. So basically get a bunch of third-party breaches, take all of the credentials from them, and test them against every website that you could be interested in. So in that sense, it's fairly easy to carry out. The cons of cracking specifically. First and foremost, it cannot be used to bypass multi-factor authentication. So if you're an actor that specifically is interested in obtaining access to enterprise VPNs who are hopefully commonly protected by multi-factor authentication, that might not be as an effective way to do that. And also, all of that guesswork can be tedious, even though it's not sophisticated. It can be in very large volumes hard. And also, it is very targeted. If someone gets my email and a password that I may or may not be using, and they want to test it against thousands and thousands of websites, that is hard. In that sense, an attacker performing cracking needs to really choose the right target to begin with. When we talk about phishing, things change a tiny bit. First of all, phishing that is carried out well can obtain session cookies in order to bypass multi-factor authentication. So that is a plus. However, actually carrying that in a way that works in order to, again, obtain the right session cookies and all of the right data that you will need to bypass multi-factor authentication can be hard. That does require technical knowledge. That does require the infrastructure and the know-how, potentially social engineering. It does require having a lot of attention and actually carrying out a real-time operation to intercept credentials. So it works, but it's not as easy as it may be. Also, phishing, very much like cracking, is very targeted. If I'm an actor who, again, wants to phish credentials to VPNs, I need to choose the brand of the VPN that I want to impersonate. I need to either obtain access to legitimate compromised websites to host my phishing page on them or register impersonating domains. And I need to find a way to direct potential victims into these pages. All of that is, again, targeted and potentially hard, but also that creates signals that defenders can pick up. If I'm going out and I'm registering impersonating domains, threat intelligence companies will pick that up, and hopefully for us as defenders, will make the domain go down. The third option of deploying Infostealers in order to steal credentials also has pros and cons. It is very popular lately. And some of these pros and cons actually overlap. So in terms of a plus side for deploying Infostealers, that is casting a very wide net. First of all, a single infected machine can produce hundreds or even thousands of credentials. So there's a better yield for a single success, whereas a single success in phishing produces one and only one credential to the service or the resource that I was impersonating and targeting. Likewise, the Infostealer logs also come with the capability or the option to bypass multi-factor authentication. Many, even most of the Infostealers are able to steal session cookies from the machine that was infected, relay them to the attacker, and then potentially the attacker, if they're valid, can use them to bypass MFA as well. And there's many documented instances of real-life attacks that were carried out exactly with this technique. Casting a wide net, albeit mentioned before as something good, can actually be a tiny bit annoying. I can invest a whole lot in infecting millions of machines around the world and still not get even a single VPN credential just because I didn't happen to infect anyone that had VPN credentials hosted or stored on their machine. Also, setting up the right infrastructure to run hundreds of thousands or millions of infections can be hard as well, right? You need command control infrastructure. You need a way to manage all of the exfiltrated data. However, it is becoming increasingly common. It has been common for the last few years, but it's becoming even more common to have out-of-the-box solutions for that, specifically things within the malware as a service ecosystem. Now, within these three different ways to obtain credentials, cracking, phishing, and stealing them directly, as you can imagine, again, we will be focusing on that. So really, we're creating the general narrative and we're honing in not to just credentials, but specifically into Infostealer credentials. Why? A, because it's a rising threat, and B, because that seems to be a pet peeve of attackers, again, forever, but even more so for the past 2 or 3 years. So let's deep dive into Infostealers. First of all, like we did with credentials, let's create some common language around what is an Infostealer infection and what does it provide to the attacker. In short, without getting into the technicalities, when a machine is infected with an Infostealer via a fake update scam, or via phishing, or via spam, or via drive-by downloads, or basically any other means that one through which one can catch a nasty Infostealer infection, once the machine has been infected, the Infostealer harvests a lot of information from the machine. Usually, mostly what we talk about is account data, so passwords, usernames, and passwords that were stored in the browsers or in different software clients running on the machine, as well as a lot of metadata about the actual machine itself. However, Infostealers can also harvest a bunch of other interesting stuff, like compromised credit card data and autofills, basically automated form filling suggestions that were stored on the machine itself, files that were hosted on the machine, and a lot of other stuff. For an actor who spreads Infostealers, the operation is fairly simple. Again, assuming that you have the infrastructure and the way to infect all of these machines and to maintain all of that. And in order to go through that, let's again assume the identity of a threat actor that has now been able to infect 100,000 machines with info-stealing malware. Let's assume, for the sake of simple math, that every single machine has produced 10 credentials. In reality, most machines produce a lot more, but again, just to keep things simple, we have infected 100,000 machines. Each one provides 10 credentials. They come in a format that looks like so. Myself, the actor, I now have 1 million credentials at my disposal. But now what, right? I can't go to the store and buy bread or a Lamborghini, as many threat actors like, with credentials. I still need a way to monetize these credentials. The kind of the simplest way to do that would be to go into a cybercrime forum and to offer these credentials for sale. So circling back into the example that I've showed before about C-level credentials specifically for email access. That is a way to monetize credentials that were harvested by Infostealers, identified as having the right technology on them, right, based off the URL, for example, and then going and selling them to the ones to other threat actors who might be interested. Why they might be interested? Because they have, again, a way to monetize credentials to corporate emails. We also see here an example for a threat actor trying to monetize, or maybe succeeding to monetize, consumer credentials. So consumer credentials for, in this example, banks in Canada. That probably works, right? You can imagine many scenarios in which that works and in which the actor here makes some money out of it. However, that does not work in scale. And again, we're talking about threat actors wanting to make money, creating businesses, actually, and operating within a very competitive market. And just like we would if we were to talk about a legitimate business, we can assume the threat actors are optimizing and innovating and trying new business models to actually scale and make more money, because I think that's what all of us want when we try to make money, make more of it. Before we talk about how threat actors do that, how do they ramp up their operations, how do they scale, and how do they make more money and more bang for the buck on their side, let's take a side trip and talk about business models in general in legitimate business and not necessarily for cybercriminals. When we, as consumers, in the real world, looking at perfectly legitimate businesses, when we go and consume something that the business provides, we usually do that either in the form of buying a product. So that would be getting something from a business, paying a sum of money, like a one-time installment payment for that, getting the goods, and then doing something with it. Or we can consume what we're consuming from businesses in a service or a subscription model. In that case, we're usually not buying one unit of something for a price that the market has dictated. Rather, then we pay a flat fee, right, for maybe a month. And within that month, we can consume an unlimited or predetermined number of the same thing, right? In order to make that a tiny bit more specific, we can actually compare that to renting out a VHS tape, right? So 25 years ago or so, versus paying for Netflix. When I go and rent a single VHS, I pay $10 for a single VHS. I need to return that within 24 hours. When I pay for Netflix, these $10 give me a month's access to maybe one movie, maybe 1,000 movies, depending on what I choose. Within the world of legitimate business, there is a motion that, like everyone's seeing. I'm not, I'm probably not saying anything new to anyone here. There is a motion of moving from selling products to selling services or subscriptions. Not only, right? So we still see, of course, see and buy many products, but within certain worlds and within certain vectors or verticals within business, we see a motion of at least employing subscriptions on top of products. And the best way to look at that is, again, look at what we've, as a society, what we went through from a VHS tape to Netflix. And that, for example, we had a pit stop on the way, or we had many pit stops on the way. One notable pit stop were video on demand services. Why? Or why is that interesting? Because that midpoint where we still pay for a single product, but it's not a physical product like a VHS, that actually marks two different things or two different trends that we're seeing within business. The first one is automation or digitalization, where the goods that we're buying still in a product form are not physical, but digital. And the second part is servicization or moving things to subscriptions, where we consume things both automatically and digitally, and also in a subscription model. Now, that side trip to talking about abstract, non-cyber whatsoever business models is very relevant because we see the exact same thing happening with cybercriminals. Why? Again, because cybercriminals, like the ones we're talking about, want to make money. As such, they mimic the behavior, the tactics, and the strategy of real legitimate businesses. So we actually see threat actors starting with selling credentials on forums. Then we see a shift towards automated markets, in this case, like Genesis, and we'll talk a tiny bit more about that in a second. And last but not least, in the past few years, we see many actors monetizing credentials via subscriptions. So let's talk about automation without the subscription model for now. Automation and digitalization of the goods actually facilitates, as mentioned before, specialization within specific actors, right? So what we see now on the cybercrime financial ecosystem are many different automated markets that sell access to a very specific product, again, for specialized actors. This is a screenshot from one such market that specifically offers access to compromised email boxes, very similar to the post that we've seen before from a forum about an actor monetizing office credentials that pertain to C-levels. Here, it is fully automated. I don't need to go to a forum and pay someone like manually. I can go into the shop here, look at the actual targeted domain, click the buy button, pay maybe $4, maybe $15, maybe $20 for an access, and in a fully automated manner, I have access to something that I can monetize. Again, assuming that I am a cyber criminal who knows how to monetize that particular type of credentials. Otherwise, I can go to markets like Genesis, rest in peace, or not in peace, or currently Russian market, which is what we're seeing right now, and not buy a specific type of credential, rather than buy the full Infostealer log, buy the full bot with all of the files that we've seen before, right? The credit card data, the PII, the accounts that have been stolen, the metadata about the bot, just again, do so automatically. Talking about subscriptions is where things get a tiny bit more interesting. It is very common, specifically over Telegram, but not only, for threat actors to monetize credentials, and specifically, again, Infostealer logs, in a flat fee for a specific time, right? So we have here two offerings out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that we can track across Telegram, where we see, for example, here to the left, an actor that offers 170,000 Infostealer logs, meaning information stolen from 170,000 machines each month, for a flat payment of $650 a month, or of course you get discounts if you buy 3 months or lifetime access. And to the right, there's another example, different numbers, different billing or different prices, but same concept. Instead of paying for a single bot, like we were here, click buy, pay $10 for a product, we now pay for a service that gets us access to a bunch of bots in a flat fee. That has some upsides. That is fairly easy to do that, and mostly so over Telegram, because Telegram specifically provides everything that one would need. It provides file hosting, it provides APIs for management, and it provides everything that you would need to manage subscribers to your service. However, that also has downsides. That is clunky. Why is that clunky? Because as a consumer, as someone paying for that subscription, what I now get is 170,000 zip files each and every month, that each one contains, again, all of the files that we've seen before, the information file and the bot file and credit cards and autofills and all of that. And now myself, as a consumer of these cybercrime subscriptions, I need to start parsing that data, going through it, understanding what it is that I can actually use and monetize on my own. So that gives the consumer of these services a lot of flexibility, but it creates work. To deal with that, one solution that actors had is what is being commonly referred to in the cybercrime ecosystem as ULP files. ULP standing for username, login, and password. What happens here is that the threat actor that tries to monetize the Infostealer logs, the credentials obtained from Infostealers, instead of selling the raw data, like we've seen here, all of these files with a lot of text in them, they take all of that, they compile that into a single row, each row representing the three attributes of the credential, as we've mentioned before, the URL, the username, and the password. They would usually be delimited by something, so colons or spaces or pipes. And instead of selling 1.5 million bots, I can now sell 1.5 million credentials in a single file that is very easy to automate for the consumer. Very easy to search through, very easy to parse, and very easy to pass on to automated checking tools who will take each credential, parse it, and check if the user is valid. So that's the upside. It's simple to pass around, simple to monetize, simple to use. However, that does not have the context that we want. We cannot use that to bypass multi-factor authentication. We do not have all of the data that we would need to fully impersonate the user, right? No IP, no information about the browser. So basically something that's a tiny bit different, used by different actors with different ways to monetize these credentials. To put all of that general information about credentials into perspective, specifically in Kela, what we have been tracking since early 2024, and of course we have a lot before that, but just to kind of set a nice boundary, we have seen over 52 million full Infostealer logs that have been shared, monetized, sold, spread in or by threat actors, mostly via Telegram, but not only. We have seen, in terms of ULP data, so the lines that we've seen before, we have seen 3 billion unique credentials, over 15 billion non-unique credentials that we've harvested from 16,000 compiled files, like the one I've just showed. And we've seen it's actually more than 2.5 million, it's around 3 million bots that were uploaded to automated markets like Russian market. Basically, that means that threat actors swim in a big soup of credentials every single minute of the day. Many credentials can be found in the cybercrime ecosystem. Many actors can intercept them and use them for whatever it is that they want. So there is supply, there is demand, but who's actually buying that? And just to set the stage and kind of have a quick teaser to the next webinar or to the next parts of the series, avid consumers of credentials and specifically of Infostealer logs are what the industry commonly refers to as initial access brokers. Actors who are a major link in the ransomware supply chain, that act as brokers between raw data, like vulnerabilities that you can find, like credentials that are spread across the dark web, and between the actual ransomware operations. They are the link that takes credentials, matures it, grooms it, and then passes that along to the actual ransomware actors so they can go through the network, spread ransomware, and do some bad stuff. The thing about initial access brokers and the state of credentials, specifically Infostealer logs even, as they are today in the cybercrime financial ecosystem, is that all of these ways to monetize credentials, bot markets, in full Stealer logs offered in subscriptions, ULP files, are just more tools in the initial access broker toolset. They are not the only thing that initial access brokers use. They use phishing, and they enumerate vulnerabilities, and they scan networks, and they do a bunch of stuff. But the fact that credentials have become such a major part of the cybercrime economy that they can be automated and bought as a service or subscription makes them very easy to obtain by threat actors. And as such, they become a major thing that initial access brokers like very much. And just to end on an interesting note towards the next series, the next part in this webinar series, there is a very obvious correlation between ransomware attacks, as we can see here, ransomware attacks that we have tracked from 2020 until now. There is a major correlation between that and between the activity of initial access brokers, right? Initial access brokers, again, are a major part of the ransomware ecosystem. And as such, we can draw a direct line between Infostealer credentials that are making the rounds on the cybercrime financial ecosystem and ransomware attacks. And that is actually why you should care. And specifically tune into the rest of the webinar series, but most importantly, find a way to protect yourself. So if I were to summarize kind of the major takeaways, the cybercrime financial ecosystem is a business. As such, it optimizes. As such, it automates. As such, it makes the deliverables more accessible to consumers. Within that financial ecosystem, there exists a very key player, a very major key player, initial access brokers. You might think that all of these credentials, again, that they can access, that they can use, that basically gives them a competitive edge over defenders, but it doesn't have to be that way, and it shouldn't have to be that way. Cyber threat intelligence, digital risk protection services like the ones we offer give you the capability to take the edge away from the attacker. If you want to know more how and why, feel free to tune in into the rest of the webinar series. I promise that we'll talk a lot about that and some interesting stuff within that ecosystem as well.
Thank you, Ravid. Thank you very much for that fascinating webinar. I hope, well, it was fascinating for me, and I hope for everyone who joined us today. I'm looking, we did have a few questions come in, and we do have a few minutes, so let's go through them. If you still have more questions, feel free to send them. We'll try to answer them. If not online, then we'll probably mail you an answer following the webinar. So one question that came in, you talked about Telegram at some point in the webinar, and the question is, what may the impact of Telegram's recent policy changes around credentials and monetizations by attackers? Well, what would be the impact of that?
So that's a very good question. Telegram is a key component, at least today, in what cybercriminals do. It's used to communicate, it's used to monetize, it's used to a bunch of stuff. Generally speaking, we are yet to see mass migration of threat actors from Telegram, even following the arrest of Abdul and with the policy changes that came after that, right, where Telegram says that it will invest more in content moderation, it will invest more in eliminating illicit activities on the platform. At the moment, it doesn't seem like we have any immediate impact. I do think that the advantage of having a cyber threat intelligence vendor like Kela is that we make it our business to track where the actors are. We started tracking Telegram quite a few years ago when it became a thing. If something else becomes a thing, maybe they migrate to Signal, maybe they migrate to Wicker, maybe they migrate to Discord, we'll be there to notice that and to develop the capabilities to collect the relevant intelligence from these platforms. So generally speaking, it doesn't look like there is a major impact right now. However, should there be an impact, it would probably be just moving elsewhere, and hopefully, or not hopefully, we promise that we are able to track these moves as well and continue producing valuable intelligence.
Okay, great. There are two questions that came in around Infostealers, so maybe we can combine them, I think. One of them is why most of the Infostealers are not detected by EDR solutions, and maybe connect that to a general question, which is, how can I defend against Infostealers to begin with?
So these are good questions as well, and they're hard. The simplest answer is that, so why are they evading EDR and what can you do to protect? They evade EDR because bad actors play a constant cat and mouse game with defenders. They find small ways to bypass EDRs. Sometimes organizations or employees would use machines that belong to them personally and maybe do not have the corporate EDR running on them. So credentials could be stolen via a different machine rather than the one that has an EDR on it. And threat actors constantly try to come up with ways to bypass EDRs and bypass endpoint protection and bypass basically every cool acronym that security vendors use. How you can defend yourself? Follow the best practices. Again, use an EDR, use endpoint protection, use everything that your organization can, but defense works best in depth. It's not enough to just have something running on an endpoint that tries to defend it, because again, sometimes some actor will be able to bypass that. The defense in depth within that context means that even though you're protecting yourself, you should be acutely aware of what's out there. You should track credentials that make their way across the cybercrime financial ecosystem. You should be aware of what threat actors are doing, because even when something slips through your defenses, at least you'd have the right sensors to pick that up and then remediate the credentials that were stolen before they're actually exploited.
Okay, great. I think we do have time for one more question. So this one came in from Mike. It's, is MFA or setting password policy enough to protect against credential abuse?
So as seen before, multi-factor authentication works sometimes. It does not work all of the time. Phishing can still intercept cookies. Infostealers can still intercept cookies. It's not a promise that's granted that these cookies will still be valid once the attacker has them, and it does take some sophistication or some knowledge to know how to use stolen session cookies. So MFA is not a cure-all. It is highly recommended because at least it will thwart the cracking, the cracking threat. It will thwart some phishing actors, and it will make the time in which a credential is still live and is valid in terms of session cookies shorter, because session cookies tend to expire fairly quickly. So MFA, highly recommended. Again, not a cure-all, just like EDR. Still, please continue to monitor things that happen in the cybercrime financial ecosystem. Password policy, completely irrelevant when we talk about Infostealers. We assume, as mentioned in the beginning, that the actor has access to the plaintext credential that they're using. So while setting a hopefully good enough password policy, and that's a whole thing on its own, is good against cracking, it doesn't really hold anything against Infostealers. But please, please, please use multi-factor authentication for anything. Please use EDRs and endpoint protection and anything that you can. Defense in depth is the key.
Okay, I think we're almost out of time, but we do have additional questions. So maybe just a quick answer for an interesting question, which I think I even asked you myself just a while ago. What's your take on password managers? Do Infostealers lift the credentials only for browsers or also from password managers?
That is hard. Generally speaking, and I'm sure that there are many, many, many security professionals here in the crowd that would be very glad to fight me over that. Password managers, very good, still not a cure-all. 100%, it is better to store a password in a password manager than in the browser. That is, I think, uncontested. Again, not a cure-all. Use them, but defense in depth.
Okay, great. We do have a few other questions that came in, but we'll try to answer those offline. But we're just out of time. So Ravid, if you could just move to the next slide. So first of all, again, Ravid, thank you for this session, and for everyone joining. Like I mentioned, Ravid mentioned throughout the webinar, this was just the first part of a three-part webinar series. In the next webinar coming in about 2 weeks, we're going to dive deep into the whole concept of compromised accounts and how that has become the #1 cause or the #1 initial access vector for cyber attacks. And in our third webinar, we're going to take a look at some solutions, or basically how we can defend against this type of abuse. This will include also a demo of Kella's solution. And that should be a very interesting session that will be delivered again just on the back end of October. So with that, one last time.